Hello everyone, so I am Simone Utermark, a director within ICMA's Sustainable Finance Unit, and it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to this second in our LATAM webinar series, supported by the IFC. Today's event is dedicated to Brazil, looking at the potential of the sustainable debt capital market. Before I hand over to our keynote speaker, I just wanted to clarify a bit of terminology for those of you in the audience that are not that familiar perhaps with the sustainable bonds market. So let me just share some slides. So I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview. At ICMA, of course, we are fortunate enough to manage Secretariat for what is by now called the principles, because it's getting so many. And just to give you an overview on this slide, so we have the green bond principles, we have the social bond principles, and we have the sustainability bond guidelines, which are for a mix between social and green bonds. And then the latest principles are the sustainability linked bonds, which is a different type of instrument. So the first three are for so-called use of proceeds bonds, where the proceeds are financing something that is green or social or a mix. And sustainability linked bonds are actually more focusing on an issuer's strategy. So this is a bit of a development of the market. So we had the green bond principles first. They came out in 2014. That's also when the Secretariat was assigned to ICMA. Then we had the social bond principles and the sustainability bond guidelines being launched in 2017. The sustainability linked bond principles, as I just explained, they are the latest principles. They were only launched last year, so it's quite a new market, but nevertheless already quite big in size in Brazil comparatively. And then we also have something that is not a new type of principles, but separate guidance, which is the Climate Transition Finance Handbook. So just on the pictures that you see here, you will be wondering why Green Bond Principles, for example, says 2021 and not 2014. Of course, these versions get updated from time to time. So most recently, the 6th version of the Green Bond Principles was published in June this year at our AGM. And this is actually the first update to the Green Bond Principles since 2018. So with this 2021 edition, the GBP, as we call it, integrates best practices that are recognized by a majority of issuers in the market, while also preparing current and future regulatory developments, especially in the EU, because that's that region is quite ahead in that space, but also internationally. So the 2021 edition of the Social Bond Principles and Sustainability Bond Guidelines have been similarly revised. And just to give you some of the updates that we made, especially for those that are a bit more familiar with the Green Bond Principles. So the updates to the 2021 edition were that we now have 2 additional key recommendations on the bond framework and on external reviews. That is an addition or alongside the 4 core components that we had, which are use of proceeds, process for project evaluation and selection, management of proceeds, and reporting, which is divided between allocation and impact reporting. Then there was a recommendation for heightened transparency for issuer level sustainability strategies and commitments made. We also added an encouragement to supply information on the degree of alignment of projects with official or market-based taxonomies, because we noticed increasingly issuers are actually mentioning those in their frameworks. And then there was also the promotion of transparency on issuers' processes to identify and manage perceived and known social or environmental risks added. And lastly, links to references to complementary guidance, such as the Climate Transition Finance Handbook, the Harmonized Framework for Impact Reporting, guidelines for external reviews, and the overall guidance handbook for the Green and Social Bond Principles. So let me go to the next slide. This is just an overview. So we also came out with this chart this year, which I think, displays really perfectly how all of these principles work together. So on the left hand is what I said, what I explained, use of proceeds bond principles. On the right hand side, you see the general corporate purpose bond principles, the sustainability linked bond principles. And at the bottom, we have the climate transition finance handbook. So this is guidance that can actually be used in conjunction with, either, for example, a green bond or sustainability linked bond. And that is, for example, if an issuer wants to transition towards becoming greener or less brown, then they can use the guidance that is recommended in that handbook as well. So the principles have actually been quite successful, which is why we're doing all these events as well. In fact, these have become the global de facto standard that's underpinning the sustainable bonds market. And as you can see in the chart, in 2020, actually 97% of all bonds globally have been aligned to the principles. And this is a last chart just to as an introduction also for what follows on the panel later. This is the great development that we have seen in the sustainable bonds market. So the combined volume of sustainable bonds in 2021 has actually reached $694 billion US. And that actually represents a more than 80% increase over the same period in 2020. So really astronomically. And while the market is on track for certainly another record year, some even predict that we could reach the landmark of $1 trillion US by the end of this year. So we will have to see, but it's certainly an astronomical growth in issuance. And I hope this event will actually shed some light on how Latin America and specifically Brazil fits into this picture of growth and perhaps also the future growth. So, and now without further ado, I will actually hand over to the keynote speaker. And I'm very honored that we have Bianca Nasser, Chief Financial Officer at the Brazilian Development Bank, BNDES. Over to you, Bianca.
Thank you, Simone. Good morning all. It's a pleasure to be here today representing BNDES in this interesting panel that I'm pretty sure that we're going to have great discussion, considering now the panelists that we have here. And I think that it's a pleasure to be here, not only to talk about such interesting topic that it's one of the main points that we are discussing nowadays, but also to have BNDES, to have the opportunity to show how BNDES is looking to this agenda and how we expect it to sponsor it at some way in order to develop all the sustainability market in Brazil. As we could see in the interesting graph that Simone showed, we have seen an increase in the last 10 years of the green bond market, and recently some accelerated increase as well of the social bonds and the introduction of the linked bonds in the international market. And we still see the participation of the Brazilian companies and banks issuance in the international market as a small percentage of what we expect we can have in terms of participation in the international market. Definitely we're going to have experts here talking about market itself in terms of size, but what's interesting to see is that definitely this increase of the market came from a change in the mindset of the investors, and on the other hand, some kind of concern of the companies as well to be aligned to this important subject and this topic. In the local market, on the other hand, we still see great opportunities to an increase in development of this market in Brazil. And in the last years, actually, we have seen most of the local capital markets being developed for different kind of tax benefits instruments. And more recently, we have seen this tax benefits instrument also being extended to all these green and social topics, what it's a great new. But from BNDES point of view, what we see as our mission, it's really to be aligned to this agenda and stimulating the companies in Brazil to look into it carefully. BNDES has as its mission to be the sustainable bank in Brazil. And actually, 20 years ago, we created a specific department to look to the green agenda and having all these environmental concerns since then. We have great examples about how we were aligned with this agenda in order to being the first financial institution to issue a green bond in 2017. And recently, last year, actually, we also took the opportunity of this green framework that we put in place to also make a first issuance of a banknotes in the local market. And we see it as a kind of movement that we expected to see from other banks and other companies in Brazil in order to improve it. And in that sense, I think that I would try to split here my comments in 2 points. First, it would be what's the potential of the Brazilian market related to this sustainable market. And the second one, I think that it's really important to share the experience that BNDES is having and how important it is to the companies and financial institutions to think about taxonomy and report all these informations related to that. So first, talking about the potential size of this market in Brazil, as I mentioned, definitely, I believe that Brazil can improve significantly its participation in the international market by tapping it through this type of instrument. Not only I mentioned the lowest participation that the Brazil have so far, but also so far the main sectors of the economy that used this kind of instrument in the international capital market was really concentrated in energy and mainly in the energy and the agriculture. And we believe that we can extend it to different kind of other sectors in Brazil. In the local market, on the other hand, as I mentioned, we have seen this increase of the local debentures really based on tax benefits instruments. But now we have seen the same kind of concern of the local investors, and they are starting building their governance and their internal rules in order to invest in this kind of instrument, what definitely is going to increase significantly the demand for these instruments in the local market as well. And why I believe that it's important to share the experience of BNDES, because recently we took advantage of our green framework that was used to issue the first green bonds in 2017, as I mentioned, from a financial institution in Brazil. This green bond followed the International Capital Market Association rules. So it's really the principles as introduced here by Simone, and definitely it's something that we consider as a kind of need to give a credibility to the instrument. And the same framework was applied to a local issuance in Brazil. So the benefits to put in place a framework, it's really it's really related to the potential to use this framework to tap both international and local market. And definitely we see that the benefits to do that, it's not related to attend a current demand that we are seeing an increase from the investors' point of view. But also we start seeing some kind of benefits in pricing reducing the cost, considering the intention of investors to increase the participation of their portfolio on that sense. And definitely, we start seeing the benefits as well to the companies to being ready to tap the capital market, also getting benefits to access the bank markets through these instruments, following some specific KPIs or presenting some kind of green framework. What I mean that, because BNDES, for example, it's starting showing to the market the percentage of its portfolio, of credit portfolio, that is dedicated to green and social. We also showing the impacts of all the disbursements that we do according to the SDGs of the UN. And this kind of report from the financial institutions itself, it's also, we definitely believe that it's gonna be something very usual from now on. And it's another point that is very important to the companies to consider, that by the time that they are gonna be ready to disclose information or to put in place some specific framework, they're gonna get the benefits to not only access capital markets, but also access the bank market. And taking consideration all these points of reports, I would say that we still have a lot of challenge, definitely, on that sense, in terms of standardization of the taxonomy, how we're going to report, in kind of how to measure the impacts. But definitely, we have to start to do that to improve this kind of discussions, and that's why this the debate today that we're gonna have, it's so important. I would like to add as well I talked about the potential of the Brazilian market, but this potential is not only related to the increase of our participation, considering the current demands, but also the type of projects that we can develop that are going to be very important to develop this market. I'm going to change now to another mission that BNDES has nowadays in order to improve its development position, development bank position as its main mission, that it's really related to the mission to reduce poverty in Brazil and to reduce inequality and giving access to all the population to the basic needs. So in that sense, we are establishing different kind of rules to develop and give incentive to some specific sectors that include clean energy, that includes sanitation, that include transportation. And all of these segments definitely are gonna have the opportunity to generate huge of different kind of funding alternatives that can have the capital markets as a great opportunity of financial vehicle. In that sense, the BNDES is acting as the investment banking of the federal government, and we are leading different kind of concession and privatization projects. And the sanitation, for example, it's one of the main sectors that we are stimulating and put in place different kind of rounds of concession competition. And we're gonna have great opportunities to finance the capex of this segment through the capital markets and the sustainable and green bonds, for sure. Another important movement that we did recently, although we don't have from BNDES point of view actually a funding needs or some specific plan to tap the market right now, we announced a sustainable framework in addition to our green framework to really be able, and at the same way, following the principles of the International Capital Market Association, in order to be ready to also tap the sustainable bond market, that we believe that it's the next movement, the next step from a strategic point of view of BNDES, that we believe that it makes sense to stimulate at the same way the other companies, Brazilian companies and financial institutions in Brazil to do that. So in addition to the projects and the potential projects that we can expect it to come from the Brazilian market, all of it related to this green and social market, I would highlight as well our relevance of BNDES to finance the lack of infrastructure in Brazil. And definitely we can build great opportunities in the transportation side, for example, to develop some kind of instruments related to linked bonds, or at some way, even in the industry, we see the linked bonds as a great opportunity to also, put some specific segment that it's not exactly green, to be aligned to all the climate change concern, all the environmental concern. In that sense, from our internal policy as well, we build some specific linked credit policies to give benefits to our clients to reduce their financial costs in case they attend some KPIs. So in other words, we also not only trying to stimulate this market in Brazil, trying to stimulate the companies to access this market locally and international. And also we are trying to apply these principles in our credit policy in order to also incentivize our clients to go on that way in this agenda, but also to have the benefits to keep improving our targets, improving our percentage of our credit portfolio dedicated to these segments that, on the other hand, these segments, I mean, green and social, that on the other hand, we're gonna also open great opportunities to BNDES have access to the international and local market issuing green or social bonds. Finally, I would, before finalize here my speech, that I believe that I could cover most of the relevant points that I believe that BNDES it's trying to incentivize in terms of the development market. We are also trying to improve our position as investor, potential investor of these local and international bonds. And we are creating internal policies as well that is going to allow BNDES not only to participate in structuring and distributing or providing some kind of financial support as guarantee to some specific projects that are going to issue local or international bonds, but also we going to have some kind of goals to participate as investor, giving some kind of additional comfort to the market about the demand of some specific projects that are going to be very important to the development of the Brazil. So definitely we're going to have, we have, as I mentioned, some kind of really lack in the of infrastructure, some needs of development of basic needs to the population in Brazil as the sanitation. And now this project, we wanted to be involved in the fully cycle of financing, not only providing finance itself, but also stimulating these potential projects to tap the capital markets through these instruments. So saying that, I really believe that the Brazilian market have a great opportunity to lead this or to have a relevant position in the development of these sustainable bonds internationally, and a great potential to develop the local market. On that sense, that of course could also take the benefits of the participation of the foreign investors. So thank you very much again. I really wish we have a great conversation, and the main message is BNDES really gonna keep being involved in this agenda, and we can you can count on us to any kind of development on these instruments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bianca. That gave us a good start for the panel, and very encouraging to see BNDES being so active already and wanting to be even more active. So I will actually also moderate the panel, and let me just briefly introduce my panelists. I'll just go in the order of the slide that you see in front of you. On the panel, I will be joined by Frédéric de Maris, head of Brazil Financial Institutions Group at UBS, and he also is looking at fintech, and luckily for me, he's also an adjunct professor at Columbia, so we will have lots to talk about. Alfredo Modetsky, a director within the fixed income team for Latin America at Santander Asset Management. Then we have Luisa de Vasconcelos, ESG and fixed income international debt capital markets at Itaú. And last but certainly not least, I'll be joined by Cesar Sanchez, who's the head of sustainability at B3, which is of course the Brazilian stock exchange. So welcome all of you. So Bianca just set the scene a little bit talking about Brazil, but I thought in order to start this panel, also following from the chart that I showed on the astronomical growth in the global sustainable bonds market. Perhaps Frédéric, with UBS being a Swiss investment bank, you could give us a bit of an overview on what's going on in the global market and also how that compares to Brazil. And perhaps after you, Luisa, can come in and also talk a little bit more about Brazil directly. Over to you, Frédéric.
Sounds great. Thank you, Simone, and thank you, ICMA, for organizing this great event. And I'm very happy and honored to be in such great company to discuss this important topic. Maybe to start, I think you mentioned with your slide about the global market, an idea of the size of that market, and Bianca also linked it with the reality in Brazil. Maybe adding a few numbers to get a sense of where Brazil stands today and where, when we look forward. You mentioned, issuance year to date in 2021 of about $700 billion globally. So that's a huge number. It's a growth of, you mentioned 80%. Maybe we get to 100% growth, so doubling of the market in 2021. It looks like this is feasible. When you look at the Brazilian market, year to date, up until September, we got to approximately $10 billion. So obviously a very simple comment here. First, it's a huge number for the Brazilian market. It's a huge increase year over year. So you really see that issuers, investors, the whole community is really excited about this growth. But at the same time, the flip side is that it's still a small number in global terms, as you and Bianca mentioned. So we're talking about Brazil representing slightly less than 2% of global issuances. So huge potential ahead, and obviously we have to think about the hurdles and what we need to solve in order to to tackle or to grow this market. One thing that was also visible on your slide is the breakdown by category of sustainable bonds. So between green, social, sustainable, and the SLBs, which is the newcomer, the latest one in the group. Globally, green is about half of the market. It's a bit less. It's 47%. In Brazil, pure green is about a third of the market, 35%-ish, which obviously doesn't mean that Brazil is less green or less focused on green markets. And I'm sure, Luisa will comment on this as well. When we talk to issuers on the investment banking side, green is a huge, concern, something that they really want to tackle. But the Brazilian market is specific in a sense that we have a lot more sustainable bonds. So we have a lot more KPIs that are trying to tackle both the green side and the social side. And we very often talk about co-benefits. So that's why you have a bit less of pure green. But obviously, it would be a misunderstanding to say that the companies are less focused on the green. They try to tackle both the social and the green. Maybe two things I would mention, to launch our discussion, or two trends that we've seen both globally and locally. Well, the first one is that the local market is definitely implementing or tropicalizing, as we say, a lot of the good trends that are happening elsewhere in other geographies, be it Europe or the US or other ones. So a lot of the principles that you would find for issuances in any country globally, those are the same principles that issuers follow here. There's no, really try to follow the same best practices and learn from what other issuers are doing. What has been interesting, especially year to date, is that you have an increasing number of issuances in local currency. So I think Bianca mentioned, that back in the days, the issuers were really in energy, in agribusiness, especially pulp and paper, because those companies in their respective sectors are global leaders. So they were really used to tapping the international markets. We're seeing a lot of the local companies that are maybe a little bit smaller, issuing in local currency with local instruments. Bianca mentioned the bank notes, letras financieras, definitely something that is set to grow, and BNDES was a leader when they issued that green letra financiera, green banknote. So that's a new trend. It's great, it's going to grow, and it's definitely visible. A second trend, which I think we've all seen, is it's really a positive message. Again, it's a smaller market. We're a few years behind maybe other geographies, but with what we've seen at companies, and maybe Cesar will confirm this or contradict me, is we've seen a lot of companies, the sustainability team, really working hand in hand with the CFOs, the treasurers, and that's something that is true, more and more with a lot of companies. Very often when we engage with issuers, we tell them to think about their frameworks, their KPIs, their metrics way ahead of an issuance. So it should not be something that you kind of rush to do because there is a need on the CFO side, on the treasurer side, but it's something that a lot of companies think about for months and months, and they put together their framework, they think about their metrics, and that can go together with an issuance on the debt side. But also what I find is really interesting in our discussions with clients is we're more and more discussing about green equity, or what a green IPO or green follow-on could look like. So we're going a little bit beyond debt issuance and really thinking about, any type of capital issuance should be in theory applicable for that, sustainable theme that we're having. So those would be maybe some of the key trends that we're seeing. Lots of discussions about metrics and choosing the good KPIs, but I'm sure this is something we will be discussing during our discussion in the next hour. Back to you, Simone. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. Those were a lot of points, and we're certainly going to dig a little bit deeper on some of these. And it's very interesting also to hear when you talk to your clients. And again, we're going to talk about this a bit more, but this is really, even with the use of proceeds bonds, not just with the ones that have a focus on the corporate strategy anyway, but even with the use of proceeds bonds, such as the green bond or social bonds, that really requires an effort by, a lot of people and departments in a company. So it really brings together treasury and sustainable finance, sustainability departments, experts, green experts, social experts, investor relations people, corporate finance people, the CFO, of course, the CEO, everyone. So that's really a great thing with the sustainable bonds market. But let me just hand over to Luisa before we come back to some of your points and see if Luisa wanted to add some observations on the Brazilian market specifically as well.
Sure. Thank you, Simone, and the ICMA team for the invitation, and hi all, good morning. So I think Frederick, he touched very important, interesting points. Brazil is indeed a market that is growing very fast. Just to bring some numbers, when we look to, Brazilian companies, they basically have two main markets that they can access. The first one is the euro and dollar market that they use with offshore investors, and the second one is the local market. When we look at first the offshore market, we had 30 issuances since 2015 that were ESG, and out of those 30, 16 were made this year. And if we look to what they were, 13 of those were SLBs, or sustainability linked bonds, showing that this type is really growing. And even when we look historically from 2015, the market has really picked up in 2020 and 2021, which is something that Frederick also mentioned. So when we look to the type of transactions, we can see that in the offshore market, investors or capital providers, they do have a bunch of dedicated funds that are able to invest in this kind of issuances. And that comes to most of the times to a pricing benefit. So we saw in the beginning of the year, and I know Clubin participated early on in the event that you guys promoted, they were the first one to actually see what we call the greenium, or the green premium, which was actually the ability of actually issuing below their established curve just because they had an ESG feature. And what we have been hearing from investors, specifically in the US and Europe, is that they're very much interested in the sustainability structure because they provide us with an upside in case the company does not comply with the set targets. I'm not going to go into details in that topic because I know Cesar as a issuer, they will probably comment on that because they did a great job in their first pure social issue in Brazil. But then when we look to the local market, the market is also developing a lot. And I know that Frederick mentioned the trend, right? And also Bianca highlighted the importance of also having like the local currency transactions. When we look to the numbers, we have around 100 issuances since 2016. Out of those 100, 45 were done in 2021. So that's a lot. The SLBs, or the sustainability link, is not as developed. So we are seeing the same trend that we saw outside of Brazil, starting with the green, the social, sustainable, and then sustainability linked. And here, the situation is a little bit different because the investors are not as many as we have offshore. We have mainly 5 ESG credit dedicated funds that can invest in this type of assets. We mapped the size of those funds, and like in the end of 2020, they were around 200 million reais, and now they have doubled. They're more than 400 million, but it's still very little when you consider diversification and a lot of rules that they need to follow. So I agree with Bianca when she says that in Brazil, like the regulatory and tax environment will definitely play a role in the development of the market, because if we can get those positive incentives, that will also make the market develop faster and get more companies engaged with the team. One of the discussions we have very often with our clients regarding like what are the real benefits of doing transactions like those. I think the first one is like access to special financing and also the ability to like align capital allocation with sustainable development goals, right? Everyone knows that all the development goals set by the UN were very important. And I think over time, companies, issuers, banks, structures, they're getting more aware of the importance of like having that. I also mentioned the greenium that we see in those transactions. So there's like a financial benefit of doing so. And that's probably why we get all the treasury departments very engaged. But I would say that one of the very interesting things that we saw happening, and I think in B3 case that's super evident, is that we bring together not only the treasury, which is like the department that the investment banks were used to deal with, but also the sustainability department. So we get more like internal connections, and that really stands for the fact that ESG, or like doing ESG transactions, it's something that is transversal, and you need to get ability and engagement from several stakeholders, not only inside the organization, but also outside. And of course, there's the reputational factor that I think also comes into play. So Cesar will probably go over that. Like when B3 did their sustainability linked issuance linked to diversity KPIs, they really like brought the flag and the discussion into Brazil, which was super important. So I think the first companies to do so will also have that effect. That stewardship that Bianca was mentioning, that it's also the role of BNDES, but I think that would be something very interesting to see how it plays out in the next few months or even years, right? And I think when we look to investors, like what we have been hearing is that if in the past, when we did an ESG transaction, we didn't have as many investors engaged in ESG discussions, we would talk more to the PM. Now we're seeing that they're also setting up specific teams. So ESG is not only a check that they do in the investment thesis, it's more like something that they really take into consideration. And they're even considering more when they think about allocation into their funds. So I think, or I would like to believe, that this will contribute to long-term sustainability, not only for issuers, but also to investors. And that would also add to like all the trends that Frederick was mentioning before. So having more local currency, have more contacts, but also like trying to develop a market that specifically in Latin America and in Brazil, since Brazil represents like more than a third of Latin America, would be very important. And then just to touch briefly on the structures, when we discuss with our clients this possible ESG structures that you mentioned before, Simone, like the green, the social, the sustainability, which are like more use of proceeds defined, and also like the sustainability linked, or even the transition structure, we are seeing that because investors tend to prefer sometimes the sustainability linked, companies are leaning towards that, but not everyone is there in the same point, or every sector plays out the same, right? So we have been seeing like financial institutions, for instance, doing more use of procedure structures just because the impact that they can have with those kind of structures is much higher, and it's much more complicated to actually set targets just because their business is to provide loans and have portfolios. So that's how they can create more impact. And I think that impact investing is something Frederick will probably touch a little bit later, but it's also very interesting, and we need to take all those factors into consideration because there is no recipe or no one fits all model that we should apply towards all the clients throughout Brazil.
Okay, thank you very much, Luisa. Another very interesting few points added. And as you said, SLBs with Brazil, of course, SLBs, as I mentioned last year, are still quite a nascent product in the market because we only came out with the sustainability linked bond principles last year in June. But nevertheless, we have actually seen an uptake globally, and a lot of that actually in Brazil. So proportionately, compared to the rest of the world, we have seen a lot of SLBs being issued in Brazil already. And Suzano, in fact, was even, was not only the first LATAM SLB issuer, they were also at the time last year, they were only the second issuer in the whole world to issue an SLB. So let me come on that note to Cesar, because Cesar, you just issued a sustainability linked bond as well, and you set another first in the market in that you were the first stock exchange to do so. Why don't you tell us a bit more about how that came about? Why didn't you want to issue a green bond, perhaps, for starters? Why did you decide to issue an SLB, and what went on behind the scenes, maybe?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Simone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you and the whole ICMA team. I think you started with a very interesting question. Why sustainability linked bond? So, as you mentioned, we were the first stock exchange to issue SLB. Not only that, we were the first Brazilian company to issue SLB abroad with social KPIs only. And when we were working with our team, I think Luisa brought an interesting point, Frederick as well. So those type of projects, we work together with our treasury as well. So our CFO and the whole team, together with Luisa and her team, which they have done a great work together. So we look at, for instance, our materiality map. If you look at the MSCI materiality map for exchange, you see that environment is 5%, social is 35%, and governance is 60%. So in terms of relevance, we identified the social bit as one of the areas that we could contribute the most. We have done a lot of good work in terms of governance, and I'll give you an overview in a minute. But that's why one of the reasons why we have decided to go for social KPIs. But it's also consistent with our strategy. So I'll go back in time just to give you an overview of the work we have done over the years, starting back in 2005 when we launched our corporate sustainability index. Was the fourth sustainability index in the world. And we joined the United Nations Global Compact as well. In 2009, we had our first GRI annual report. We started to disclose our involvement through CDP. 2011, we became carbon neutral. 2012, we were a founding member of the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative. In 2014, we joined the World Federation of Exchange. 2017, we committed to women's empowerment principles. And in 2021, we had our fully audited annual report in line with GRI, SASB, and CDP, and United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So we have been doing a lot of work on the sustainability front, and the sustainability linked bond is consistent with that work. So in that, in the framework, we have included 2 KPIs. The first one is to increase the percentage of women in leadership positions to 35% by the end of 2026. The second KPI is to launch a diversity index by the end of 2024. And in that index, we aim to invite companies to disclose information about diversity, for instance, the percentage of women in leadership roles in the companies listed at B3. So it's a bit of we walk the talk. So we have set, what we promote to the market, we have set for ourselves also ambitious targets. So the framework is consistent with our strategy, our sustainability strategy, which includes 3 cornerstones. The first one, adopt the best ESG practices. The second one, promote those practices in the market. And the third one, develop products and services that are related to ESG. So that's a very brief and overview of what we have done and why we have done that. First and foremost, the ESG objectives, right? So as I said before, we want to advance those best practices, right? And second, set for ourselves targets that are consistent with that. The second reason is about diversify our financial structure, tapping into international markets. And the third one is to have a longer debt maturity profile. So, but first and foremost is the sustainability part, the sustainability bit, right? So we have raised $700 million, right? And the best investment firms in the world were interested. Out of the top 15 investment firms, 9 of them have a strong focus on sustainability. So in that sense, I think was a great success. And but the goal really is to promote sustainability. I'm of course biased, but I think sustainability is the most one of the perhaps one of the greatest opportunities we have, the humankind has, to make to make the difference and use everything we have learned so far to create a better, more sustainable, diverse world for the future. So, thank you.
Wow, that was almost a closing statement, but it's really important, and that actually brings me to Alfredo. And as you said, I think the most important thing is actually while we create all these instruments and we find investors in them, and in fact, yes, we sometimes see a greenium because there is so much more demand than supply in the market. But what's really important, especially in the wake of the Paris Agreement and the climate change threats and biodiversity, and also the pandemic has shown us the social side as well. So it's really important to also see the link to the real economy and that we have an impact on this. And I'm going to come back to Frédéric later on this. But let me move on to Alfredo, the investor in our round. And Alfredo, there has been a lot of enthusiasm about SLBs. And as I said, it saw a great pickup in Brazil, but also globally, especially among issuers that perhaps don't have enough green projects to finance. And if it's an issuer with such great ESG credentials such as B3, it also makes sense. But just in general, perhaps, what do you or what do investors in general make of SLBs? Do you still prefer use proceeds bonds? Do you think this is a great new development? How would you evaluate this?
Okay, thank you for the question. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm glad I'm the only client investor here. So I will try to represent the investor base. I think, and we talk about that before sometimes. I think the SLBs are a huge instrument, very powerful instrument, and very, very useful, because with the use of proceed things, we end up being auditors of the use of proceed, meaning of the deployment of the money that the issuer takes on the project that they promise, but not on the outcome of this project. So this is what the SLBs allow us to do in terms of reaching significant KPIs, which are nothing else but the outcome of investing. It's true that it's in general a corporate purpose. It's true that, I mean, we left this door open so the issuer can actually decide what to do with the money. But at the same time, they invite us to check on the attainment of certain objectives that are not present in green or social bonds. So the structure is quite appealing. Now, on top of being an investor, I am a European investor in Latin America. So that brings us to another layer, which is the new European Union regulation. And I would like to very briefly touch on that, because I think it's gonna get a lot of consequences. First, on the European Union taxonomy, which I already saw that there were some questions from the audience coming in. I know it's a subject that a lot of people are looking into it, and there are also local taxonomies being developed. Many countries have been working very hard on that. There's also the SFRD reporting, which is very important. I mean, where asset managers will not only report by their green investment, but by their overall investment. So that's also a very interesting development. So it's really not casual that we are seeing much more interest coming from European investors than local investors in Latin America in the respective markets. So that's the good things, right? And now I can talk about the risks. Of course, I mean, it's a huge opportunity, but there's also a big risk. And of course, the risk has been greenwashing, and it has been raised this issue again and again. And we like that it has been raised, because we also try to fight greenwashing. I mean, we are convinced about how powerful these instruments are if they are used in the good way. But we know the risk of not using them in a good way. So we are also, in a way, vigilant of the proper use of the proper selection of KPIs. Cesar talked about the materiality map. I think it's very important when we start coming out with KPIs that they come from a materiality map. So the targets, the performance targets that the bonds have are significant in terms of the actual risk that the company is facing. Another thing, a very interesting thing, it comes from the European Union taxonomy. For instance, if one activity is defined with a particular threshold in terms of emissions, whether it becomes a sustainable activity or not, we as investors would like to understand if these KPIs will bring us very close to the threshold, or we'll still very far away from the threshold. So I think that the taxonomy, which was really written in order to bring transparency, comparability, and ambition, I mean, we can also bring these principles into the whole green market. I mean, generally speaking, in order to bring more transparency, more comparability, and if possible, more ambition.
Thank you very much, Alfredo. And just for the audience out there, if you want to learn more about the EU, all these regulations that Alfredo mentioned, such as SFDR, which is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which means a lot of new disclosure obligations for investors and asset managers, and also disclosure obligations under the taxonomy and so on. ICMA just published a paper on that, and you can find that on the EU disclosure regime on our website. That just as a side note, to put that into context, actually on taxonomies, and I don't know if anyone wants to briefly respond to that. We've had 2 questions in the chat, whether Brazil is actually working on a taxonomy as well. Now, I have to admit, I don't think so, or I don't know exactly. I know that Argentina and Chile, for example, are 2 Latin American countries that are members of the International Platform on Sustainable Finance as well, which currently comprises 17 global members, and they're working under an initiative led by the EU and China. They're all working on a common ground taxonomy so that we don't have too much fragmentation in the markets when every country or region comes up with their own taxonomy. But I don't know if anyone knows what's going on with regards to taxonomies, just briefly, because we had that in the chat. Is Brazil working on that? Is it looking into that?
Yeah, what I can say, Simone, is that we're not looking into taxonomy, but we're looking into regulating the capital markets like you guys did internationally. So we know that ANBIMA, the local association for capital markets, they actually have a group that it's working in the team. We participate, UBS too. So there should be something coming in the coming months. Well, that was repetitive, sorry. But what I can say is that we are trying to align it very much with what we have internationally, because I think the idea is not to create different norms. It's more to combine everything and make as flexible as possible so that both investors and insurers can actually have flexibility to define what fits best. Because every country has its own reality, right? So if you look, for instance, for the energy matrix in Brazil, and I'm sure Bianca can add a lot to that, internationally having something over 80% of clean energy is amazing, but Brazil per definition is above that already. So how do you incentivize Brazilian companies to improve that situation, right? Even though it's already really good if you compare it globally. And we have other situations where it's the other way around. So I would say more than defining a taxonomy, we are defining the rules that are going to be used. And with that, we can just use whatever we have internationally.
Thank you. And of course, the audience might have seen that Banco do Brasil also made a start on climate risk scenarios. They're going to require stress tests from 2022. And this is something, a lot of countries are actually making TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure requirements, mandatory. Now, Brazil is going to make a start with financial institutions. And this will actually allow banks to compare the financial performance of their loans and investments according to the ESG, environmental, social, and also climate risk level. So very interesting that this is going on there as well. And I think especially now in the wake of COP26, which is going to be in Glasgow in November, we see a lot happening in that sphere with climate change, actually. But let me come back to perhaps Frederic. We have heard about impact reporting and impact investing, and with use of proceeds bonds, but also with SLBs, the corporate general corporate purpose bonds. Reporting is a very important element. You have actually both. You have the allocation reporting and you have the so-called impact reporting. And if this is done properly, you could actually call the sustainable bonds an impact investing instrument as well. But how do you see the progress in that? Because I know it's definitely something that investors keep asking for, and perhaps we can have Alfredo comment on that again as well. It's something investors really want, and it's coming back to what I mentioned before. It's because we want to see this link to the real economy. Investors want to see that they're doing good with their money. that their investments are actually achieving something in climate change or for biodiversity restoration, what have you, or on the social side. What is your experience in that space? Are we making progress?
No, great. It's a great great theme actually for all of us to think about and brainstorm, because I don't think we have a key answer or a single answer to this at this stage. But let me add just one point to what Louisa just mentioned about, how do we use the best practices from other regulators? Can be the EU taxonomy, but it can be other other rules. And Louisa mentioned very rightly everything that's been done by the ANBIMA. ANBIMA would be the group, the association for investors and asset managers in Brazil. So very related to what you see for SFDR that you mentioned a few minutes ago, Simone. Maybe on the other side, or because we have two banks here, and banks are a very important intermediation agent. Anything that is related to TCFD is also analyzed very closely. And as you might know, the Central Bank of Brazil has a group focused on implementing stress scenarios that are climate related. We're also talking about nature related metrics for reporting, but I think we're going to start with climate related for now. So very TCFD inspired. I think the key point here is to say that obviously, Brazil is very well aware of the best practices globally, and we're trying to implement without reinventing the wheel, but also being aware of the specificities of the market. And what is interesting is that a lot of this push is coming from industry association. So either asset managers or banks. B3 obviously has a huge role as a company, but also as an enabler, which is what they're doing right now. So it's coming almost from the private sector, maybe less from Congress, which is what happens in Europe. But regardless, it's definitely happening. So just wanted to add this on how where the change is coming from, let's say. But back to your question about metrics, super relevant. It's a big theme, and it's interesting because obviously we have Alfredo on the investor side. But if you think of one of the biggest topics we discuss, both with investors, but also with issuers, they're all very, very concerned about greenwashing on both sides. So when we talk to issuers and we talk about KPIs and metrics, which is always very complex and detailed, that's kind of one of their biggest concerns as well on the issuing side. They don't want to get a backlash or something bad happening in the press after they've issued. So that's definitely present, in the minds of the whole issuing teams. When we think of metrics, a lot of I feel a lot of need for technical assistance. A lot of people on the company side don't necessarily have the tools to know exactly what investors would be looking at or what would be the right metric to use. So TA or technical assistant is definitely needed. That's why you see a lot of external experts, but also that's why you see the banks, developing dedicated teams to advise, to help issuers, define the right metrics, understand how to disclose them, and so on and so forth. So it's becoming very technical. And when you think about ESG, you could be talking about human rights with the utilities companies. You could be talking about diversity, obviously. You're going to be talking about CO2 emissions. It's very diverse. So we need more technical skills to help companies. And when we think of the metrics themselves, I think some of the participants already mentioned, SDGs, the taxonomy, the EU taxonomy is always a great, influence or inspiration for the issuers, the IFC impact principles, but, all kinds of frameworks that we are using. IRIS obviously helps a lot. But I think some of the metrics that we discuss, some of the rules that we discuss with issuers is always to focus on something that's material. Materiality map was mentioned by Cesar. It has to be material. It has to be significant. It has to be verifiable because investors, are not able to dispatch people, in the regions in Brazil to verify those numbers. So it has to be independently verifiable. And so when you put all this together, that's where you get to the metrics. Maybe just to finish here, obviously we get the metrics to make sure that the company is aligned, with what they are portraying or saying. But we also get the metrics to think about the premium. So back to the discussion on the financial side, And Cesar didn't mention it, but obviously the two metrics that the company defined are linked to a potential step up in case the company doesn't reach them. Obviously, we're sure they will reach them in a few years, but that's how you link, and that's the beauty about the SLB, is how you link, you know, that speech, that objective of the company aligned with the financial, you know, step up or step down, depending on the structure. But so metrics is a huge theme, obviously, for issuers and investors.
Yes, thank you. And I was actually going to come back to that with Cesar, because we couldn't have let him talk about everything in the beginning. But let me just come to Alfredo to comment on the impact reporting as well. And I would also like to mention that at ICMA, in addition to all the principles, we also have lots of guidance, including on impact reporting for both green and social bonds. We have the so-called harmonized frameworks on impact reporting. And again, you can find that on ICMA's website, or perhaps Liane will paste it in the chat. But Alfredo, how do you see impact reporting? I said it's really increasingly important for investors. Is that true? And are you getting enough on that side, and or do you still need more standardization, perhaps?
Impact reporting is very, very significant. I think that it's a tool for the time being. I think the demand on the fund side is much more on the ESG side than on the impact. If you think that there is a threshold where the pursuing of profits, it's not so important, right? Like the pursuing a particular impact target. So from our demand, we thought we're going to get a lot more. We are working on some projects that are with the European Union, and we have a partner, and we have been developing for Latin America a particular vehicle that we are very proud about, and this is targeting impact. But we need, as Frederic was mentioning, we need help from technical assistance providers, external consultants, and definitely we are not ready to do this on our own. But I wanted to raise this issue also to my co-panelists in terms of because as Luisa was mentioning, I mean, for international investors, the main issuers that were able to tap the market from Brazil were well-established companies, at least at the very beginning. Now we are seeing some new names, but mainly we had some companies that were already well known by the investment community. So, and we are seeing that there's a lot of process in the local market with new names, different names, and probably more impact, probably more sectors that are not that big to be represented in the international markets. We don't have wind farms in the international market. We don't have, so there's a lot of interesting things going on in the local market that international investors may not have full access to. So my question will be to our co-panelists: what is needed in order to bring this bridge? Because the currency is not that important. Everybody can hedge the currency. So what do we need?
I can take that, Simone, if you want, but I think what's needed is the cost of it. When we compare like the rates in the local market and the rates in dollars swapped to reais, because normally the currency for those issuers are reais, right? Their costs, revenues are all denominated in reais. So when we compare those two, if you don't have revenues in dollars or like a strong justification because of the size or like the diversification of pockets, they tend to just stay in the local market just because it's cheaper. And it's sometimes also easier, right? Because what we have sometimes is like the language barrier. So if you have like a documentation that it's governed by Brazilian law, then you can have your local team doing it. It's much easier than like going offshore, having something denominated in dollars that you would need to necessarily hedge. In Brazil today, we don't have the hedge for really long-term maturities, and those projects tend to be longer. So a hedge for a tenure longer than 10 years can get very expensive because of the liquidity of the swaps. So I would say many of those wind power projects, or even like solar projects, they're very long term, like 15 years sometimes. And then they can use the law 12,431 that we call Lei 12431, which Bianca probably knows very well, but it gives like a benefit for individual investors to buy those papers. So actually issuers can benefit from that and get like lower rates in the local market. So all the positive like tax and regulatory benefits that we have over here kind of distort the market, making the local market much more attractive than offshore. But of course, companies like B3 that also raise locally, but they're so big that they need money everywhere. They have revenues in dollars, so they can have a natural hedge. Then it makes more sense to go offshore. Or even like the big exporters like BRF, Klabin, Suzano, that for them it's a lot easier.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And let me just come back to Cesar and what Frederic mentioned before on the bond characteristic or the financial or structural element of the bond. So with SLBs, just for the audience, you have 5 core components, and we already talked about KPIs. So Cesar actually mentioned the social KPIs. Key performance indicators, and then those have to be calibrated, as we say, to sustainable performance targets. So they have to be quantified. And then, of course, as Frederic indicated, if the issuer, in that case B3, doesn't reach them, there will actually be a structural element. And a lot of issuers are actually choosing at the moment a coupon step up. There are other options as well, but Cesar, maybe you can just talk a little bit about that as well, what you have chosen and also how you've come up with that. And if it's a coupon step up, perhaps how did you decide on how big that coupon step up should be?
Yeah, yes, Simone. Yeah, Frederic is right. We have two step ups in our framework. So because we have 2 KPIs, we discussed that with our teams, and we decided to go for 12.5 BPS by the end of 2024, when our goal is to launch the diversity index. So if we don't achieve that, then the interest rate goes up by 12.5 BPS. The second KPI, we are supposed to deliver on that goal by the end of 2026, and we have another increase of 12.5 BPS. So that's the structure we chose, because we have 2 KPIs. Going back to the point of reporting, and sometimes I tend to reflect upon a phrase that says that what gets measured gets managed. So I think it's important in that sense to reporting is quite important. Data analytics is getting more and more important, so investors can understand if those investments make the difference, right? So they can manage the allocation of capital better, and also engage with companies like ourselves or the market. In our case, as Frederic said, I think we have 2 roles. We look at B3 as a company, and we try and adopt the best practice, but also we advance those practices in the market. And more and more we see ESG integrated into strategy. We talked about that in the beginning, but again, I think it's very important that we are, as Luisa said, ESG is quite transversal. So we work with a number of different teams inside the company, especially the treasury, our CFO, finance teams, and you see that ESG is integrated into strategy, risk management. When you look at asset managers, materiality is very important. You see TCFD getting more and more important, and that's of course for a reason. You see a number of extreme events, weather events, and I could talk about other topics. But I would like to go back to the second KPI, which is I think very, very important again in terms of reporting. The goal is to launch a diversity index. So we're going to invite companies to disclose information about social aspects. When you look at environment, I think we have some information. We have done some work. There's still a lot of work to do on the E front, if you will. But you have CDP. You can have a few for energy. You can have a few for emissions. But when you look at social, there might be some work to do. I think we need a lot of information on that front. And that's why data and analytics is getting more important. So once you have that information, then we can look at what we need to do for the future. Just to give you a few numbers, so I can explain that better. From the beginning of the Industrial Revolution until now, we human beings, we have emitted something close to 2.4 trillion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, right? We still nowadays, every year, emitting 40 billion tons of CO2 every year. And I think we have a budget of 400 billion tons of CO2, 10 years, if we don't reduce that. And the IPCC has shown that there's a chance that the temperature will go up anyway, even if you go to net zero by 2050. So we do need data. We do need to measure. We do need to manage those projects. So we make sure they are contributing to our goals.
Thank you. And it's indeed, that's still the biggest threat to humankind or mankind, climate change. But as I said before, biodiversity and social are also important now. And I thought it was interesting that in Brazil, we haven't actually had a social bond yet. We seem to have had a couple of social impact bonds. And very importantly, there is a difference. A social impact bond is a pay for performance instrument, if you will. Pay for success instrument is not really a bond. But while, especially in 2020, in the wake of COVID-19, we have seen a lot of social bond issuances aligned to the social bond principles. We haven't seen that yet in Brazil. Let me just, because in the interest of time, we have 11 minutes left, I believe, let me come to another topic that we haven't talked about yet, and that's, of course, transition. We've also had a question in the chat, Luisa, someone asking which industries have the biggest potential in Brazil related to sustainability debt markets, or sustainable debt markets, as we would say rather. And I think rather than saying potential, it's perhaps also how do they finance, right? We have industries for whom it's probably easier to raise finance through issuing a green bond. But then Brazil also has a lot of industries such as agriculture, for example, where it might not be so easy, and industries that actually have to transition. So for those, on the one hand, it makes sense to perhaps issue an SLB, but especially if it's related to transitioning to become greener in a sense of reducing CO2 emissions, it obviously has to go along with any disclosures on that front, and for that the handbook that I introduced earlier could be helpful. But Luisa, maybe over to you. How do you see that, especially some sectors in Brazil that, as I just said, probably have to transition? We have agriculture, we have the meat industries.
Yeah, sure. I think we strongly believe in the transition here at Itaú, and we say that the ESG is not going to be like a picture. It's going to be a process that you're going to take the first step and then one after the other until you actually get to a point that you're more mature in the discussion, that you can probably issue an SLB or something. But every industry and every sector has its pattern. As Bianca mentioned before, I would say energy, agriculture, and infrastructure tends to be like the sectors that had more of those kind of issuances. That doesn't mean that the opportunity it still lies there. I would say all the brown sectors, if we see like oil and gas, if we see like the chemicals, I think there is a huge potential for not only the capital markets, but also the banks as lenders to actually act as like an agent to promote that transition. Just coming to those companies, like working together with them to put together a plan for like the climate change, on how they're going to address that. I know that a bunch of banks are like engaging in the net zero commitment, right, on TCFD. So like this is not only going to become more stringent on the side of the banks, but also like companies will be required to give more disclosure, to give more transparency to the terms and to the strategy. What I would say is that Brazil nowadays, if we look like the pool of all the companies, we still have a lot of family-owned business or not as much of professionalized or publicly held. Like the number, and Cesar probably knows that super well, the number of the public held companies compared to the total pool of companies is still small. So I would say that will be a process that we need to get everyone more conscious about the issue and like work towards making the first step, even though we know that at that point they won't be able to like have a full report, to give disclosure and everything, but at least they will be like getting their board on board. And I think there is also a paper from Bain in that regard. It's like those kind of decisions need to come from the top, because when we look where those transactions emerge, the company normally has their business strategy, their sustainability strategy. In the point those two converge, this is when we have a sustainability department and finance department working together. If they're not still in that point, maybe it will take a little bit longer. And in that sense, like the banks, both as advisors and as lenders, have a huge impact on like promoting that process. I would not necessarily say we have a preference on sectors. Like you can look to the profile of like Banco do Brasil or Itaú and see like which banks tend to lend more to which sectors. I would say that in our case, at least, and Frederick can comment on Banco do Brasil, we want to help our clients transition, and that doesn't matter the sector they're on. Probably like pure players, like pulp and paper companies, they will be more straightforward and easier, right, because of the business. So they're going to be able to do SMBs. But like other more intense sectors that emit more, like petrochemical, like oil and gas, it's just going to take a little bit longer, because it's not only the bank promoting something, it also needs to impact like the way they're doing business and how they set their strategy in the long term. So
thank you. And perhaps briefly from Frederick as well, you obviously work with financial institution issuers as well, but I found that we haven't actually had that many green bonds, for example, from financial institutions. So SLB are perhaps not an ideal instrument for financial institutions, but it should be easy for them to finance a loan portfolio with green bonds. But we haven't actually seen that many. What are you hearing in that respect? Any thoughts on that?
Definitely, and totally agree with what Luisa mentioned. And again, when you think of banks, you can think of the investment banking side as advisors. You can also think about the credit side, as pure lenders. So it's true that in Brazil, we haven't seen a lot of green bond issuance from banks, from the FIG sector. BNDES, again, was a leader in this case. But you have a lot of green loans or, green credit or ABC credit, when you think of the agriculture with low emissions. So there is a lot being done by the banks on different fronts, not only on the capital market side, and that's obviously definitely impacting companies, corporates in their day-to-day. You haven't seen a lot of, pure green bonds or pure social bonds, but again, I think this is something that will take time, and we are definitely advising clients on the transition. We always joke internally or discuss internally to say that if we only focus on the best in class, the greenest companies, we're going to feel great about this, but we're probably not going to have the biggest impact that we should be having. So we totally believe in the transition as well. Maybe one example I would give you, it's not Brazil, but it's still Latin America. CABE, which is a bank or multilateral, they launched their the first social bond in the Swiss market. Actually, that was last month. Only focused on social side, which is a theme we discussed, during this panel. And the use of proceeds here is, for education, healthcare, infrastructure, which again are topics we discussed, over the past hour. And we felt that the demand was, larger. There was a a premium, not a greenium in this case, because it was a social bond, but we were able to get a better pricing for the company, for the multilateral. So all this good story that we're seeing is definitely happening, from even from LATAM issuers. So we're gonna, see it more and more for Brazilian issuers. But again, the key message here is that the banks are a key player in this transformation, and we're big believers of the transition for sure.
Thank you. And maybe a last point, we have actually seen a lot of sovereigns already issue green bonds. We have seen, of course, a lot in Europe, Germany. We've just had the UK come out with the largest sovereign issue to date. We've had Italy, Spain, but also in Latin America, Chile is really big. I wonder if we ever see a green bond from Brazil. I take it that at the moment that's a bit difficult because of regulatory barriers. But maybe last question to Alfredo. Would you invest in a bond from the Brazilian government that's used to, let's say, save the Amazon?
Well, I mean, why not? Yes, of course. I mean, this is something that would be analyzed from from the use of proceeds and the strength of the commitment, and also, I mean, how well it explains its strategy. I think that as you said, I think Chile has been the lead country in Latin America and I think that they deliberately went to the capital markets to force this transparency in reporting, in showing what they were doing, and put a benchmark to other countries and to the country in the future to be committed to this sort of reporting. And of course, I would be delighted to hear the same thing from Brazil. Just a very, very quick note on the transition as investors. I have to say, as European investors, again, there is a caveat here that even if, and I fully agree with Frederick that it has a huge impact. It has probably a higher impact than just investing in things that are good per se. But don't forget that we need to report our alignment with the taxonomy, our alignment with green, and the things that are brown report as brown. I mean, they are not reporting as brown getting better. They report as brown. This is just a picture. So that means that in a way, I mean, this is something that regulators still didn't raise, and it works against the holding of transition bonds. So this is just a very small point that I wanted to add.
Thank you. And I should say the EU taxonomy is actually trying to cater to that by, they also have transition activities and also with the EU GBS by introducing elements there. Yeah, you wanted to add a last point, Cesar?
Yeah, I actually would like to answer Luisa's question. So with a couple of numbers, B3, I just had a look at the numbers here. Roughly, we have 439 listed companies, right? Out of that total, we have 189 in the Novo Mercado listing segment, which is one of the most stringent. In contrast, in Brazil, by the end of 2020, we had over 19 million active companies in the country. So that's a few numbers just to think about.
Thank you, Cesar. Yes, and numbers always put everything better into context. So we're actually bang on time. But as you can tell, this was a very interesting discussion, and I'm sure we would have no problem talking about this for another hour. But we said the event or the panel would be an hour, the event 1.5 hours. So with that, I think I'm going to close this panel. I want to thank again all my panelists. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your contributions. For the audience, I would also like to point out, we've talked about Chile. We actually have an event similar to this dedicated to Chile in December. And before that, we have another one dedicated to the third largest market in the sustainable bond space in Latin America, to Mexico next month. My colleague brought up a slide. I've done a little introduction in the beginning on terminology, but if you're curious now and you would like to learn more, we also offer proper education courses that you can do live streamed or also online self-study. Again, just go to our website and then you can register for that. And with that, I think we're gonna end this. Of course, we will send you some requests for feedback. It would be nice to hear some constructive feedback from you that we will also use then for our next events. And hopefully you enjoyed this event and learned a lot. So thank you again for your attendance. Thank you to the panelists. And with that, I wish you a good rest of the day. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.